The Nexus hummed, a discordant symphony of alien languages, clanking machinery, and the distant whoosh of passing starships. For Anya Sharma, a freelance xenolinguist, it was the sound of home, or at least, the closest thing she had to it these days. Her small, cluttered apartment, tucked away in a less-than-glamorous corner of the station's Earth sector, was her sanctuary. It smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the faint, lingering scent of exotic spices she'd picked up in the Zytharian marketplace the day before. She was hunched over her desk, surrounded by holographic displays filled with linguistic algorithms, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face, and her ever-present oversized glasses perched precariously on the bridge of her nose. Anya was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, a trait that served her well in her chosen profession. At 27, she'd already traversed a good chunk of the galaxy, deciphering languages no human had ever heard and navigating social customs that would make even a seasoned diplomat blush. Her passion for linguistics wasn't just a job, it was a relentless need to understand, to connect with something other than herself. A polite chime from her datapad interrupted her reverie. Incoming assignment, a synthesized voice announced. Varkonian diplomat Kale, preliminary linguistic profile needed before scheduled ambassadorial meeting. Priority level, high. Anya groaned, pushing her glasses up her nose and rubbing her tired eyes. Varkonians, she muttered, grabbing a protein bar from a nearby container. Always with the complicated vocalizations. They were a notoriously stoic, reptilian race, and their language was like trying to untangle a ball of sentient yarn made of sound. Still, a challenge was a challenge, and Anya thrived on them. She quickly gathered her gear, a portable translator unit, a recording device, and her trusty datapad, and headed to the designated meeting room. The Nexus was a melting pot of cultures, and each sector reflected the diverse needs of its inhabitants. The Varkonian sector was a study in contrasts, stark, minimalist design, cold metallic surfaces, and a distinctly oxygen-poor atmosphere that felt oppressive to human lungs. Anya made a mental note to double-check the oxygen levels on her suit. She entered the meeting room, and her breath caught slightly in her throat. The room was vast, sparsely decorated with a few angular sculptures that looked like petrified lightning bolts. In the center stood Kale, the Varkonian diplomat, and he was impressive. He was tall, easily towering over her, his scales an iridescent emerald green, and his large golden eyes were as expressive as a desert rock. He was not stoic, he was a mountain. He looked distinctly uncomfortable, almost like a majestic eagle trapped in a hamster cage. Anya, being Anya, almost immediately put a foot in her mouth. "Wow, you're bigger than I expected," she blurted out, cringing inwardly at her lack of professionalism. "I'm Anya Sharma, xenolinguist," she quickly added, extending a hand, which she immediately regretted. Kale's golden eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her hand, then he did something she didn't expect, he bowed slightly, a stiff, formal gesture. He did not take her hand, thankfully. "Kale," he rumbled, his voice a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to resonate in her bones. "Diplomat." His voice was a low, powerful drone, each syllable drawn out and complex. The translator unit on her wrist sputtered a garbled interpretation, something about honored prey and binding contracts. Anya made a mental note to recalibrate her translator. "Right, well, honored to meet you, Diplomat Kale," she said with a nervous smile, pulling her hand back. "I'm here to take some preliminary linguistic samples, get a feel for the dialect. We'll try some basic phrases, see what we can get." She pulled out her recording device, trying to appear confident despite her racing heart. Kale nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her. "Speak," he commanded. There was an odd intensity to his look, and Anya suddenly felt under a microscope. Anya started with a simple phrase in Galactic Standard, the common language used throughout the galaxy. "Hello. It is nice to meet you." Kale's translator unit immediately translated it into Varkonian, and Kale answered back. What came out was a complex series of guttural sounds, his voice fluctuating in pitch and tone. Her translator struggled to keep up, spitting out a mixture of odd phrases like honorable mating ritual, chosen one, and strong nest. She could almost smell the pheromones coming off of him, which she thought might be part of the translator's mistranslation. He was definitely stressed. Right. Okay, let's try something different, Anya said, frantically tapping the screen of her datapad. She tried a different phrase, this time about weather. The weather is fine. Kale responded, his voice deeper, more resonating. The sky weeps tears of joy at your presence. My nest grows warm. The translator unit sputtered again. It was becoming clear that something was very, very wrong. Anya blinked, trying to make sense of it all. Was he being sarcastic? Or was the translator malfunctioning so badly? She glanced at her own translator, but it seemed to be working well. Perhaps the Varkonian language was simply too different. I think the translator might be having a moment, she said, forcing a light chuckle. Let's try something else. How about just your name? Kale straightened, and his voice resonated with the force of a small earthquake. Kale, he said, the sound echoing in the room. My nest yearns. You are, he paused, his golden eyes boring into her soul. Chosen. This time, the translator, after a very long pause, gave her only one word. Bondmate. Anya stared at him, her mind reeling. Bondmate? Did he just call her a bondmate? What was happening? She laughed nervously. Okay, I think we are having some kind of communication breakdown. She tried to speak more slowly, hoping it would help with the translation process. I'm a linguist, I study languages, I'm not a bondmate. Are you sure about that? Maybe you're a little stressed? Kale did not seem to understand her confusion. He took a step towards her, his iridescent scales flashing. Bondmate, he repeated, his voice softer but no less intense. The scent of him, which she now recognized as some kind of pheromone, intensified. It was a complex mix of musk, ozone, and something vaguely metallic. It was disconcertingly attractive. He tilted his head, as if trying to see her from another angle. You please my nest, he rumbled, and Anya's jaw dropped. My nest, she repeated, feeling a strange mixture of confusion, alarm, and something else that she couldn't quite name. Her translator unit sputtered again, spitting out ritual mating dance is imminent. She looked at Kale again. His golden eyes were glowing, his scales shifting to a shade of emerald green that was almost luminous. He started to sway slowly. Oh, no. This was not good. He then reached for her hand. My bondmate, he said, gently encircling her hand with his massive scaly fingers. The bonding starts now. Anya stared at their joined hands, feeling a blush creeping up her cheeks. Her heart was beating like a hummingbird trapped in a cage. This was not how her day was supposed to go. She was a linguist, not a love interest in some bizarre, interspecies mating ritual. And his pheromones were definitely messing with her head, she decided. She took a deep breath and tried not to panic. Right, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. I think we need to stop this right now, Kale. I think your translator is having a massive meltdown. Or, perhaps, it's translating you more correctly than I'd like. I'm not a bondmate, and we just met. I'm going to go home now. This is a very big misunderstanding. Before she could pull her hand away, Kale let out a deep, guttural vocalization that echoed through the entire sector, his scales flaring. Then he did something that was, to Anya, completely bizarre. He bowed slightly again, and took her hand, lifted it to his face, and kissed her knuckles. She could smell the pheromones and feel a tingle from where his lips touched her skin. Right, Anya muttered, stunned. The Varkonian diplomat was definitely not what she expected. He'd certainly made an impression, and she could already feel a headache coming on. Well, this is going to be interesting, she said mostly to herself. This chapter ends with Anya staring at Kale, who now looked almost smug, and realizing that she was in way over her head. The Varkonian had definitely misinterpreted something, and she was afraid that her day was just about to get a whole lot more chaotic. Anya practically sprinted back to her apartment, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and barely suppressed panic. The image of Kale, the stoic, imposing diplomat, kissing her hand and calling her his bondmate kept replaying in her mind like a broken Hola recording. It was absurd, hilarious, and more than a little unsettling. The lingering scent of his pheromone seemed to have followed her, clinging to her clothes and causing a strange, fluttering sensation in her stomach. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. Her small apartment felt like a safe haven, even though it was barely larger than a storage unit. She dumped her gear on the floor, kicked off her boots, and flopped onto her worn-out couch, letting out a frustrated groan. She reached for her datapad, frantically searching for any information on Varkonian mating rituals. The results were, to put it mildly, horrifying. Okay, so bondmate isn't exactly like dating, Anya muttered, scrolling through the endless stream of cultural documents. It's more like chosen for life, immediate nesting, and possibly ritualistic displays of affection involving raw meat. Her eyes widened. Raw meat? What had she gotten herself into? She was starting to think the mistranslation was not so much a malfunction of her translator, as the translator simply trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Her comm unit chimed, and a small hologram of her Zytharian friend, Xylo, flickered into existence. Xylo was a tall, spindly being with iridescent skin and large, multifaceted eyes. He was also a font of knowledge about the various cultures of the galaxy, and had a very dry, sarcastic sense of humor, which Anya valued highly. Well, Xylo's voice drawled, his tone dripping with amusement. What's this I hear about you being claimed by the stoic Varkonian diplomat? Are you finally settling down, Anya? With a scaly giant who probably prefers his dates rare? Anya groaned. It's not what it looks like, Xylo. Or, well, maybe it is, but it's a massive misunderstanding. He thinks I'm his bondmate or something, and he keeps talking about nests and ritual displays of affection. The translator was going completely haywire. Xylo's multifaceted eyes narrowed, a sign that he was genuinely curious. Ah, yes, the Varkonian mating ritual, he said, tapping his chin with a long, slender finger. It's intense. They are very direct, very focused, and their concept of courting tends to involve elaborate public displays, gifts of significant material value, and a lot of pheromonal output. They believe in immediate gratification of desires. Have you noticed a change in the atmospheric conditions, perhaps? The air around you, so to speak. Anya's cheeks flushed. Okay, yes, there were some interesting smells. And my head felt a bit fuzzy. Is that a pheromone thing? Is this how they manipulate each other? Xylo chuckled, the sound like wind chimes in a storm. Ah, yes, the pheromonal influence. Varkonians produce powerful pheromones, especially when they are stressed or, shall we say, enthusiastic. They can be quite persuasive, even to species that aren't biologically compatible with them. Especially during their courting time. It's probably why your translator was trying to interpret his sentences as mating calls instead of simple conversation. Anya buried her face in her hands. This is a disaster. What am I going to do? He's a diplomat, he can't just go around claiming random linguists as his bondmates. Xylo's holographic form flickered a little before he spoke. Well, technically he can, but I agree that it's extremely ill-advised, especially given the diplomatic ramifications. But it is the Varkonian way. Perhaps a cultural exchange program is needed? Or perhaps you should just go with it. Maybe it would be fun? Think of the linguistic data, he finished with a chuckle. Fun? Xylo, he tried to kiss my hand. And he kept talking about building a nest. Raw meat, remember, she exclaimed, waving her hands in exasperation. Yes, I can only imagine. The displays of affection are known to be overwhelming. Be prepared to be serenaded with loud vocalizations, offered large portions of raw meat, and possibly even get some decorative markings done on your skin. It's their way of showing devotion, or so I've heard. I'm curious about the actual application. You know, for linguistic research, Xylo said, barely hiding a mischievous grin. Before Anya could argue, her comm unit beeped again, this time with an incoming call from the Varkonian embassy. She hesitated, feeling a knot of dread forming in her stomach. With a resigned sigh, she accepted the call. A stern-looking Varkonian, his scales a shade of deep blue, appeared on her screen. Anya Sharma, he boomed, his voice a low rumble. Diplomat Kale requests your presence at the embassy. Preparations for your bonding ceremony have commenced. Anya's jaw dropped. Bonding ceremony? You're planning a ceremony? We just met yesterday. And it was a total misunderstanding. The Varkonian ambassador blinked his golden eyes slowly. Misunderstanding? You are the chosen bondmate. Diplomat Kale's wish is my command. Preparations are well underway. You will be treated with the utmost respect. He paused for a moment before adding. The bonding ceremony will happen in approximately 1 standard day. Be prepared. And then the screen went blank. Anya stared at the now empty screen, feeling a mix of shock and disbelief. 1 day? They were actually planning a whole bonding ceremony? She was starting to think that Xylo's idea of this being fun was not at all based in reality. And what was she supposed to do with this information? Before she could formulate a plan, another chime announced an arrival at her door. She peered through the peephole and groaned. It was Kale. He was standing there, filling the entire doorway, holding what looked like a large, wriggling mass wrapped in a dark cloth. The scent of his pheromones, now much stronger, wafted in, causing Anya to feel lightheaded. This had to be the gifts part of the Varkonian courting ritual that Xylo mentioned. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was a highly trained linguist, and she could handle this. She opened the door, forcing a polite smile. Diplomat Kale, she said, trying to keep her voice even. What can I do for you? Kale stepped into her apartment, his large frame making the small space feel even smaller. He held out the wriggling bundle. Gifts for bondmate, he rumbled, his golden eyes fixed on her. Nourishment. Comfort. Anya cautiously unwrapped the cloth, and her jaw dropped. Inside was a pile of raw, glistening meat, various cuts of alien animals she couldn't even identify, some still twitching slightly. She almost gagged. Thank you, she managed, forcing a smile. That's very thoughtful. But I'm not sure I'm ready for nourishment quite yet. Kale looked confused, his golden eyes narrowing slightly. You do not accept the gifts? He asked, his voice laced with a hint of disappointment. Are you not pleased with my offerings? My nest yearns for your approval. He then started to emit a long, low, resonating hum that seemed to shake the very foundation of her apartment. Anya felt the pheromones washing over her, and her head was spinning. The scent was stronger now, more intoxicating. He was definitely stressed, and it was definitely having an effect on her. Anya swallowed hard. No, it's lovely, she said quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. But, perhaps we could just talk about this whole bondmate thing before we start the ritual eating part? Kale's response was another booming hum. He gestured around her apartment, a frown on his face. This nest is insufficient. I must make improvements. Before Anya could stop him, he started moving her furniture, his strength like that of a small crane. He reorganized everything, moving her couch next to her bookcase and pushing her table into a corner, and Anya could only stare at the bizarre scene unfolding in front of her. This chapter ends with Anya staring in bewilderment at her completely rearranged apartment and the pile of raw meat on her kitchen counter. Kale, meanwhile, looked at her expectantly, and was still humming. Anya realized that navigating the Varkonian courting ritual was going to be the most challenging linguistic puzzle she'd ever faced, and the stakes were way higher than she could have ever imagined. The Varkonian embassy on the Nexus was an exercise in austere opulence. Cold, polished obsidian floors reflected the light of the stark, minimalist fixtures. The air was thin, slightly chilled, and carried the faint scent of ozone and something vaguely metallic. Anya, still reeling from the chaotic events at her apartment, was escorted through the embassy by 2 stoic Varkonian guards, each easily twice her size. They were silent, watchful, and their scales gleamed under the harsh lights. She felt like a small, slightly disheveled field mouse being paraded through the halls of a reptile palace. She was taken to a private chamber, where the Varkonian ambassador, the same stern-looking blue-scaled individual from her call, was waiting for her. He was surrounded by a cluster of Varkonian attendants, who seemed to move with a silent, practiced grace. Kale was standing beside the ambassador, his iridescent green scales shifting slightly with each breath he took. His gaze was fixed on Anya, an intensity that made her both nervous and strangely drawn in. "Anya Sharma," the ambassador rumbled, his voice echoing slightly in the vast chamber. "We welcome you to the Varkonian embassy. You will be treated with the utmost respect as the chosen bondmate of diplomat Kale." Anya forced a polite smile, trying to ignore the flutter of unease in her stomach. "Thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate the hospitality, but I think there's been a slight misunderstanding. I'm not actually diplomat Kale's bondmate." She glanced at Kale, who simply stared back, seemingly unconcerned with the conversation. The pheromones were still there, faint but noticeable, making it hard to keep her thoughts straight. The ambassador raised a scaled eyebrow. "Misunderstanding? Diplomat Kale has declared you his chosen bondmate. It is a matter of Varkonian law and tradition." "Yes, but..." "I think he might have misunderstood the situation. My translator had some difficulties with the Varkonian language. It interpreted my professional interest in linguistics as romantic interest, and it seems to be spiraling," Anya explained, feeling like she was explaining basic astrophysics to a particularly stubborn rock. She was beginning to feel like a character in an absurd theater play, and she didn't know the script. Kale finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "Bondmate is chosen. Bondmate is pleasing. Nest is awaiting." He took a step towards Anya, and she could practically feel the heat radiating off of him. The pheromones intensified slightly, adding a confusing pull to the strange situation. Anya sighed. "See? That's not how things work on Earth, or most other planets, I suspect." The ambassador exchanged a look with Kale, before turning back to Anya. "Explain, human. What is the error in your reasoning?" He sounded like a very strict teacher waiting for the correct answer. Anya began to explain the Earth traditions of courting, of taking time to get to know someone before making a lifelong commitment. She tried her best to clarify that for humans, the word bondmate was not just a term, it was a representation of deep affection, years of building trust and respect, and was based on genuine choice. She did not think that Kale completely understood her, but it seemed that the ambassador listened with more interest than she anticipated. She took this opportunity to ask if she could read some of the relevant passages of the Varkonian law in the original language, hoping she could better understand what was going on. The ambassador looked thoughtful. "Very well, human. You may examine the relevant legal codes to understand our ways better." He made a small gesture, and a Varkonian attendant approached her with a large, heavy-looking datapad. Anya took the datapad, her fingers tingling from the touch, and began scrolling through the Varkonian text. She was used to dealing with complex, intricate languages, but the Varkonian legal code was a whole other beast. It was dense, archaic, and filled with subtle nuances and layers of meaning. She had to admit, the Varkonian language, though difficult, was also strangely beautiful. And what she found in the text was extremely concerning. It stated that a chosen bondmate is seen as a representation of the political power of a diplomat, and that the bond was not purely a matter of emotion, but rather of political position. This wasn't just a romantic mix-up, it was a major political move. As she delved deeper, she realized that Kale was under immense pressure from his family to form a strong bond in order to secure his position and solidify his family's political standing. This wasn't about her at all, it was a political game. And she was now a pawn. She also realized that the Varkonian word for bondmate has several layers of meaning, something her translator had failed to grasp, translating them as the chosen one or the one that pleases the nest. This was far more serious than she originally thought. She looked up, her gaze meeting Cale's, and she realized that he wasn't just a stoic diplomat, he was a man caught in the middle of a difficult situation. His gaze wasn't just intense, it was also full of something that resembled a mixture of hope and panic. She could definitely smell his pheromones now. And she knew from the Varkonian text that stress was one of the main reasons for pheromonal release. She realized that she had to try to help him, even if that meant going along with the charade for a while longer. "Ambassador," she said, putting on a brave face. "I see now. The Varkonian concept of bondmate is more complex than I initially understood. I need to understand the culture better. I need to ask more questions. I need to study the language more, to see all the possibilities." The ambassador nodded slowly. "Indeed. It is a complex undertaking. But the bond between a Varkonian and their chosen mate is one that cannot be broken." Anya took a deep breath and turned to Cale, her gaze locking with his. "Diplomat Cale," she said, her voice softer. "Perhaps we can discuss the details of this bond later. I would like to know more about your customs, your traditions, your nest." She added the last part with a small, slightly ironic smile, hoping to lighten the mood. Cale seemed to respond to her words, his green scales shifting slightly to a brighter hue. He took a step closer, the pheromonal scent intensifying again, making Anya's head swim. "You accept," he rumbled, a hint of hope in his voice. Anya swallowed hard. "I accept the challenge, Diplomat Cale. And I will learn everything I can to understand your culture." She wasn't sure if she was just playing along or if she was starting to get swept away by the bizarre situation, but she had a feeling that this was going to be a long, strange journey. And she was starting to realize that it was getting less and less undesirable. Maybe it was the pheromones, or maybe she was starting to feel something genuine for the stoic reptilian diplomat. The ambassador looked pleased. "Excellent. The preparations for the bonding ceremony will continue. You will be treated with the respect due to Diplomat Cale's bondmate." He gestured to one of the attendants, who approached with a collection of beautiful, intricately carved jewelry. "These are traditional Varkonian gifts for a chosen bondmate," the ambassador explained. "Wear them with pride." He gave her a small smile. Anya took the jewelry, each piece cool and smooth to the touch. They were beautiful, intricate pieces, each with their own unique design. As she tried them on, she realized that she was starting to feel like a participant in a Varkonian ritual. And the thought, somehow, didn't make her want to run away. This chapter ends with Anya wearing the Varkonian jewelry, staring at her reflection in a polished obsidian surface, and realizing that she was now fully immersed in this bizarre, politically charged, pheromone-infused charade. She was starting to understand the gravity of the situation, but at the same time, she was beginning to find herself strangely drawn to Cale. And she was curious to see what would happen next. The following days were a whirlwind of cultural immersion, linguistic studies, and increasingly confusing interactions with Cale. Anya had been given access to the Varkonian embassy's extensive library, a treasure trove of ancient texts and holographic recordings. She devoured the material, trying to unravel the intricacies of Varkonian society, law, and, most importantly, their mating rituals. She discovered that the bondmate concept was less about romantic love and more about creating a politically advantageous alliance and carrying on their genetic lineage. But, like with any culture, there was a deeper layer to it all. Meanwhile, Cale continued his attempts at courting, albeit with a slightly modified approach. The raw meat offerings had ceased, replaced with gifts of exquisitely crafted, though still rather bizarre, Varkonian art. He would often appear at her door, his large frame filling the entrance, and simply stand there silently, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her cheeks flush. He was learning to respect her personal space, at least, as much as a 6-foot-tall reptilian diplomat could. He would also hum quite a lot, which Anya was starting to find less irritating and more, strangely soothing. She also realized that she was starting to learn how to interpret his humming, it was a whole language of its own. So, Anya said one afternoon, sitting across from Kale at a large, obsidian table in one of the embassy's private rooms. According to these texts, your family is expecting you to secure a strong political alliance through this bond. Is that right? Kale nodded slowly, his iridescent scales catching the light. It is expected. It is our way. His voice was still a low rumble, but she could detect a hint of something akin to frustration. She was starting to pick up on the nuances of his tone, and she was definitely starting to notice the subtleties of his pheromones. They were different when he was stressed, or frustrated, or interested. It was a whole new sensory experience. But Anya continued, tapping a finger on the holographic display. It also says that the bond must be mutually beneficial. Not just for political gain. There must be something more, a connection between the two. She decided to test him. Like, say, a mutual affection, or something of the sort. Do Varkonians believe in affection? Kale tilted his head, a gesture that Anya was starting to recognize as his equivalent of a puzzled expression. Affection, he rumbled, as if the word was foreign to his tongue. It is not necessary. The bond is for strength, for security. The merging of bloodlines. It is also to ease the mating. His voice dropped slightly at the last word, and Anya could swear that his scales took on a slightly reddish hue. Anya suppressed a smile. The stoic diplomat was actually blushing. It was adorable. She was definitely falling victim to the pheromonal influence, she decided. Well, she said, leaning forward. Perhaps, we can find a way to make this bond mutually beneficial and also, perhaps, include some of affection. Maybe we can turn this political obligation into a more personal relationship? Or at least, a less bizarre one. And we can also change the wording of the bonding ceremony. We will have to write new versions to keep the political ramifications, but also make it clear that it's not just a mating ritual. She winked. Kale stared at her, his golden eyes wide. Then he did something unexpected. He let out a small, almost imperceptible chuckle. The sound, like gravel being ground together, sent a shiver down Anya's spine. You intrigue me, human, he said, his voice a low growl. You think that we can change our ways? That we can change our mating rituals? To make them more to your liking? He moved closer, the pheromonal scent becoming more potent. Anya's heart skipped a beat. Maybe, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Maybe, if we work together, we can create a new kind of bond, one that respects both our cultures and other things. She was definitely pushing the limits here, but she was also curious to see how far Kale would let her push. You are bold, Kale said, his gaze locking with hers. Too bold, perhaps. But your boldness is pleasing. Anya suppressed a grin. And your directness is refreshing. Perhaps our differences are not such a bad thing, after all? They spent the next few days poring over the Varkonian texts, trying to rewrite the bonding ceremony to reflect a more balanced approach. Anya, with her linguistic skills, crafted new phrases that spoke of respect, understanding, and a mutual commitment to their respective cultures. Kale, surprisingly, was open to her suggestions, and even proposed some changes of his own. It was as if they were slowly, carefully building a bridge between two very different worlds. During these late-night study sessions, Anya and Kale started to develop an unusual kind of friendship. They would discuss their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Anya learned that Kale, beneath his stoic exterior, was a complex individual with a dry sense of humor and a hidden passion for Varkonian astronomy. She also learned that he enjoyed it when she would correct his pronunciation of some of the more common human words, and that he would listen to her reading for hours. She also learned that his pheromones seemed to change with his moods, and that she was starting to learn how to interpret them. They had become a bizarrely functional team, navigating the complexities of interspecies relations, and, despite the circumstances, enjoying each other's company. However, their newfound partnership was about to face a new challenge. One evening, as they were working on the final revisions to the bonding ceremony, the communit beeped, announcing an incoming call. It was a Varkonian, his scales a dark, angry shade of red. Anya immediately recognized him as Kale's rival, Jax. Kale, Jax's voice boomed, his face contorted with a sneer. I have heard rumors of your unusual bondmate. A human? How pathetic. You are weakening our lineage by choosing such a creature. It makes our family look weak. I am coming to the Nexus to challenge you. To show you and everyone else what a mistake you are making. He turned to look at Anya. And I will also show this creature her place once we have done with your duel. Kale's scales flared a vibrant green, and Anya could feel a surge of his pheromonal output. He stood up, his large frame casting a long shadow across the room. You will not touch her, Jax, he growled. She is under my protection. Jax laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Protection? You think you can protect her from me? From the truth? Your bond is a farce, Kale. And I will prove it. He ended the transmission abruptly, leaving Anya and Kale in stunned silence. Anya took a deep breath, adrenaline surging through her veins. This was not what she had signed up for. Well, this just got a whole lot more complicated, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. A duel? Seriously? What is this, some kind of space opera? Kale turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and concern. It is expected, he said, his voice low. Jax is trying to destabilize my position. He knows that if my political status is weakened, he could take my place. Anya realized that she was not just a pawn in this game anymore, she was a shield. She was a symbol of everything that Kale was trying to build. And she didn't like being a pawn, she preferred to be a player. Then, she said, a determined glint in her eyes. We'll just have to show him that he's wrong. We will face your rival together, Diplomat Kale. This chapter ends with Anya and Kale staring at each other, both aware that their carefully crafted charade was about to be put to the test. They had rewritten the bonding ceremony, they had started to understand each other, and now, they were facing a new challenge that threatened to undo everything they had worked for. And, strangely, Anya was feeling a strange mix of fear and excitement at what might happen next. And the pheromones were definitely a factor in her overall feeling of excitement. The atmosphere in the Varkonian embassy was thick with tension. The arrival of Jax had thrown everything into chaos, turning the carefully orchestrated charade into a high-stakes drama. The embassy staff moved with a nervous energy, their scales shifting in a kaleidoscope of anxious hues. Anya, meanwhile, was trying to keep calm, but her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was not a warrior, she was a linguist, and now she was about to witness some kind of Varkonian duel. She realized that she was actually worried about Kale, and that realization was disconcerting. Kale, however, seemed strangely composed. He had explained to Anya that Varkonian duels were less about brute strength and more about strategy, cunning, and demonstrating one's ability to defend their honor. He had also insisted that Anya stay by his side, arguing that her presence was vital to his strategy. Which, Anya suspected, mostly meant that he didn't want her out of his sight and out of the range of his pheromones. She definitely wasn't complaining, but she also wasn't going to admit that to him. The designated dueling chamber was a vast, circular room with a central platform. It was starkly lit and designed to amplify sound, making every movement and vocalization echo with a dramatic intensity. Jack stood on the platform, his scales a deep, angry red, and his golden eyes burning with fury. He was slightly smaller than Kale, but his movements were sharp and precise. Kale, Jax boomed, his voice laced with scorn. You have dishonored our family. You have defiled our lineage with this, human. I will show you the error of your ways. He gestured dismissively at Anya, his gaze filled with disdain. Anya bristled at his words, but she kept her composure. She knew that showing weakness would only embolden Jax. She was also starting to understand more about Varkonian culture, and she knew that she had to show him her courage, even if she was shaking in her boots. Kale stepped onto the platform, his scales a brilliant emerald green. His movements were slow and deliberate, and Anya could sense a calm confidence emanating from him. Jax, he rumbled, his voice resonating through the chamber. Your challenge is noted. But my bond with Anya is a matter of my own choice, and it does not require your approval. The duel began, not with physical combat, but with a series of complex vocalizations, each one a carefully crafted argument designed to demonstrate their wit, their knowledge of Varkonian law, and their ability to manipulate language to their advantage. It was a battle of words, a linguistic sparring match that had Anya captivated. She was trying to follow the intricate patterns, the subtle shifts in tone and rhythm, and she realized that this duel was far more complex than she had imagined. It was a display of intelligence and cultural mastery. It was also surprisingly erotic. Anya quickly realized that Kale was not just defending his honor, he was also subtly weaving in the changes she had proposed for the bonding ceremony. He was arguing for a more balanced approach, for a bond based not only on political advantage but also on respect and mutual understanding. It was a risky move, but Anya could see that it was working. She was also realizing that Kale was a very talented speaker, and that his pheromones were having a very particular effect on her. Jax, however, was not willing to concede. He countered Kale's arguments with increasing aggression, his voice growing louder and more strident. He was resorting to personal attacks and insults, trying to undermine Kale's position and break his composure. He even directed some of his attacks at Anya, calling her a primitive and a distraction from what really mattered. And Anya realized his insults were working as Kale's pheromonal release intensified. Seeing Kale under stress, Anya decided it was time to intervene. She stepped forward, ignoring the shocked gasps of the Varkonian onlookers. Jax, she said, her voice clear and strong, amplified by the chamber's acoustics. You call me primitive and a distraction. But you do not see that it is through me that your rival is becoming more open-minded, more tolerant, and more capable of building new alliances. She then spoke directly in the Varkonian language, using one of the more complex phrases that she had been studying for days. I think that your challenge is a sign of your fear, and not of your strength. Her words, spoken in the Varkonian language, seemed to stun both Jax and the onlookers. Even Kale looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Anya could smell his pheromones, and she was starting to recognize the scent of pride and/or desire. Jax, however, was furious. He unleashed a guttural roar and charged at Kale, his scales flashing a furious red. The verbal duel had turned physical, and Anya held her breath, watching as Kale and Jax engaged in a fast and furious display of martial skill. They were both skilled fighters, their movements precise and powerful, but Kale seemed to be more fluid, more adaptable. The battle, though intense, was short. Kale quickly gained the upper hand, and using a combination of speed, strength, and skill he subdued Jax and pinned him to the ground. Kale stood over Jax, his chest heaving, and then he took a deep breath and turned to look at Anya, his golden eyes glowing. It is done, he rumbled. The challenge is over. Jax, pinned to the floor, was clearly humiliated. He did not utter another word. The Varkonian ambassador stepped forward, his scales a calm, deep blue. The challenge is concluded. Diplomat Kale has proven his strength and his resolve. And his bond with the human Anya Sharma will be honored. He bowed his head to Anya. And you, a human, have shown us the depth of your spirit. Perhaps it is our understanding that needs to change. Anya took a deep breath, the tension finally leaving her body. She looked at Kale, who was still standing on the platform, his gaze fixed on her. The pheromones were still there, a constant reminder of the connection between them, but now they were more than just a biological reaction. They were a sign of something deeper, something genuine. So, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. What happens now? Kale stepped down from the platform and walked towards her, his movements still carrying that inherent grace. Now, he rumbled, his voice softer. Now, we create our own bond. One based on choice, understanding, and perhaps, affection. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. His touch sent a shiver through her, a mixture of excitement, anticipation and desire. Anya looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, and she knew that their journey had just begun. The accidental bond, forged from a misunderstanding and complicated by politics and pheromones, had transformed into something real, something powerful. The bonding ceremony was held a few days later, and it was unlike anything the Varkonian embassy had ever seen. It included the traditional aspects of the Varkonian culture, but also included elements of human culture as well. It was a celebration of their two species, their differences, and their newfound connection. Anya and Kale stood side by side, and as they spoke the words of the ceremony, their hands intertwined, they knew that they were embarking on a journey of discovery, a journey of love, and a journey of understanding. The final scene shows Anya and Kale, standing on the observation deck of the Nexus, looking out at the endless expanse of the galaxy. They had become the accidental ambassadors of affection, bridging the gap between two different species, and showing the universe that love could blossom in even the most unlikely of places. The pheromones were still there, a constant reminder of their connection, but now they were part of a larger, more meaningful story, a story of two souls, forever bound, not by mistake, but by choice and mutual attraction. And as they held each other, they both knew that their story was just starting.